it's really like the center of the double standard, which is how I approach everything to do with anti-Semitism. Is there is no answer that is good enough because they don't want an answer. They miss the days where Jews would just sit there and get rounded up into camps and gassed with no ability to defend themselves. And now that there are not only Israeli Jews, but American Jews who have the ability to defend themselves, they really don't like it because a fair fight, it's not quite the same.
Do you really feel like people want to see Jews gassed?
I think some people do, for sure.
Yeah,
I think I'm very careful with how I talk about anti-Semitism because I always think there's at least two different camps, right? And I think there are people out there who genuinely want all Jews to be killed. I think we're seeing some of them on American streets today, marching around, quite openly calling for Jews to be killed, that Hitler was right, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those people are also, ironically, the people who say that the Holocaust is made up. You know, the Holocaust was great, but also totally made up. Right. I also think there's a lot of just ignorant people who are really the useful idiots. And we've seen that throughout history. You know, people who don't really openly or knowingly hate Jews, but just go along with it because they've fallen into whatever the trap of the latest anti-Semitism is. So if you look at contemporary anti-Semitism, which is anti-Israel anti-Semitism, it's really nothing to do with Israel, right? It's all to do with hating Jews just through a different lens, which happens to be Israel this time. And so a lot of people will just go along with it thinking, oh, Israel is a rich Western country. Palestinians are not. Israelis are white. Palestinians are brown. They're looking at it through different lens and just skipping the thought process, skipping the history, skipping the context. And then, of course, it doesn't help when you have supposedly intellectual people like John Oliver coming out and comparing what's going on in the West Bank to the Holocaust. But because he's British and he makes funny faces and occasionally says the F word in a silly accent, he must be right. And, being British and therefore correct is my thing.
You're immune to that. We're under his spell still.
Well, we have the Jon Stewart, who's our Jew, who's like, Well, I find that the real clear distinction between the left-wing anti-Semitism and the right-wing, which I want to talk about, is, like specifically on the right, is the implicit and the explicit. Because the left wing has this core value of anti-racism. So they can't explicitly be anti-Semitic. It has to be couched in a sort of anti-colonialist narrative. But on the far right, which has been this weird ascendant thing, especially in the response to wokeness and the reactionary right that we're seeing, where, under the crusade of anti-cancel culture and free speech, we're going to say the most provocative, abhorrent things we can say, which is about Jews, because that's the group now that's front and center, and we're going to make Israel the persona non grata enemy number one. Public enemy number one. But I'm seeing it on the far right where you're finding this explicit anti-Semitism. What's your take on that and how representative it is? Because at one point during the Trump era, first term, a lot of people on the left were very happy to condemn anti-Semitism when it comes from the white supremacist ilk. And I always thought, that's marginal. Charlottesville, those aren't good people, obviously. They're not fine people on both sides. But those people are pretty marginal. They're not representative in the culture. But sadly, post-October 7th, I've been seeing, and I've been avoiding naming names for a while, but after an event like last night, Jackson Hinkle getting out there on Twitter, expressing solidarity with Hamas and rest in peace Khania and the American Communist Party, but America first, and Jake Shields and these folks who are and Nick Fuentes types, they're gaining this popularity of this edgy new frontier that is really, really disturbing to me as a Jew. And I'm curious what your take on that is of the far right ascendance.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot to unpack there. I think one is it's nothing new. It's just it appears new, right? I think social media provides us with a window into things that were already there. They were just happening in the shadows and didn't get quite the same momentum that they do today. There's a lot of monetization aspects to this, where if you've got something really this is a problem on X and Twitter, I'm ruthlessly free speech, right? I think all these people, including Nick Fuentes, who I think is a piece of shit, have a right to be on social media and a right to share all their horrible ideas, as long as they're legal and that they don't actively incite violence, things like that. But the thing is, there is a downside to that, which is, especially when it's monetized, you have people who are incentivized to share the kind of content that gets attention. And you see this from a lot of people who I don't actually think actively hate Jews. They're just jumping on this bandwagon of this stuff is pretty popular. It's almost like I'm not allowed to say it culturally, so I'll go ahead and say it. Therefore, it's correct. And there's a lot of illogical steps you've just completely leapt over. And so I think you're right in that, obviously, far-right anti-Semitism is a problem. It's been a problem for decades, if not longer, but it's part of a broad spectrum of anti-Semitism that people don't want to address. This has been my criticism of Republicans, Democrats, everyone left, right, center, is that people only care about anti-Semitism in a broad sense when it is a way for them to actually attack the other side. So, for example, in 2018 is the first time I became openly politically active is after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. Obviously, that was a white supremacist shooting. And so you had the entire left coming out in droves condemning anti-Semitism. But what they were doing is they were condemning far-right anti-Semitism, because you have black anti-Semitism, they don't care. You have Muslim anti-Semitism, they don't care. You have far-left, communist, Marxist, whatever you want to call it, anti-Semitism, they don't care. They have general academic anti-Israel anti-Semitism, they do not care. But the same is true of the right, is that everyone is all over Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. Ilhan Omar can't go outside and eat a bagel without someone talking about how it's somehow anti-Semitic. But then
cultural appropriation if she did that. Cultural appropriation if she ate a bagel.
It turns to ash in her mouth.
Yeah.
But anyone on quote unquote our side does the same thing.
Some people did something with cream cheese. Yeah. Oh my God.
That's real hypnosis right there.
Yeah. Oh my
God. But
it's
people on our side, quote unquote our side, or anyone who's close to our side.
Yeah.
They do something that Ilhan Omar would do, and it's crickets, or it's dismissing it, or it's somehow defending it. I'm not just talking about Kanye West, who's the obvious example. I'm talking about someone like Tucker Carlson, for example, who dismisses what's going on in Israel as, oh, it's just a foreign conflict. Why should we care? And then he's jet setting off to every country you can possibly name. You've got Joe Rogan, who I think is wonderful. Joe Rogan has done a lot for the free speech movement, for the libertarian movement. His show is obviously great for just conversations, but saying things like, oh, Jews love money like Italians love pizza. One, not particularly funny. I think there are far better Jewish jokes out there. But like, two, if Ilhan Omar said something like that, or any left-wing so-called comedian said that, conservatives will be all over it. And so I think that's the problem with me. It's the selective snowflakeness of both sides when it comes to the issue, and they don't actually care about anti-Semitism itself. They care about using that as a weapon against their enemy. And if it's your side, they don't really care.
So to clarify on the Joe Rogan example, because I remember like people, you're saying you're not criticizing Joe Rogan in that instance. You're saying the people who react to that are not doing it for genuine purposes of combating anti-Semitism, because whether they care if it comes, they're using it as a weapon to just go after a Joe Rogan or go after those who follow him and to say, you see, this, your figurehead must be smeared and invalidated because of some silly joke.
Yeah, I mean, I think like two things, right? One, I think what Joe Rogan said, he has every right to say. I don't think it's correct. There are plenty of poor Jews who are not into money. It's also hilarious. He got paid hundreds of $millions to a podcast. He clearly loves money and he's not Jewish. How does that possibly work? But he was also speaking in the context of talking about Israel and talking about anti-Semitism. He was talking with someone who was actively, in the moment, defending Ilhan Omar for anti-Semitism. So that matters, right? It wasn't like you and I just talking about bagels and one of us makes a Jewish joke. They were actually talking about anti-Semitism. So that matters. I don't think he should be cancelled. I don't think that means he's anti-Semitic. It was a throwaway comment. It was a joke, right?
Right.
But then my issue comes is I want people to be consistent. If you're actually anti-Semitism, that has to include when it's people who are on your side, or you really want to go on Joe Rogan's show. Because a lot of people, like, I would love to go on Joe Rogan's show. I probably never will. It doesn't matter too much to me. But I'm going to
after this episode, Ian.
Who knows?
It's a stepping stone.
Who knows?
Tell Renan's joke. Renan's joke about Rogan.
Yeah, we had a comedian friend of mine named Renan Hirschberg who said, like, he makes this joke where he's like, I just think like Joe Rogan is bad for society. He's just bad for society. I just think he is. The only way I would ever go on his show is if he asked me. If him or anyone from his team responded to my many emails, I would go on. Well, I think the fundamental difference there is that the sense of it's not the comments that people make, it's who's making the comments. And there's a subjectivity to it. Because if we trust that Joe Rogan, who has a history of being open and inclusive of everybody, has all different kinds of voices on his show and is just a genuinely curious person. So he has somebody on who, like an Abby Martin, but then he also has Coleman Hughes, and he sort of reflects the curious ignorance of a situation to be open to ideas, meaning there's not much of an agenda there, which I think is why he's so successful. And he's a comedian, then like there is a truth that he's making, and I don't think he's thinking as much about the sensitivity of the context of somebody who's talking about Ilhan Omar. He's just saying, yeah, like I know that to be true because in comedic circles we make those stereotypical jokes all the time. So he's sort of relaying that sentiment. If Ilhan Omar is making comments about Jews and money, it does not come from a good place. It comes from a more malicious place with malicious intention. So I think for a lot of people, you know, it's sort of like when your best friend calls you something versus when an enemy calls you something.
Yes.
It's the same statement, but it means very different things depending on who it comes from because of the trust factor. And we do not trust a Rashida and an Ilhad when they talk about Israel and Jews because I think their motivations are questionable at best, right?
And I think the context of that conversation is why I brought it up. right? I don't really care that Joe Rogan makes jokes about anyone because I don't care about really what any comedian says about Jews. Like their purpose is to make people laugh. I don't really care how you do that. If you care about free speech, you can't be overly sensitive and laugh at fat jokes, but then not laugh at Jewish jokes, right? I think the problem that for me is that it came in the context of someone defending Ilhan Omar's comments about Jewish gold and AIPAC being motivated by money. And the response to that was, well, yeah, Jews love money, obviously. Like that's the issue, is because if you're a comedian and you're making jokes, fine, I do not care. But there's a strange thing going on more on the right and the left of comedians hopping between comedy and political commentary. I don't think Joe Rogan is necessarily doing this, but we're seeing it on a broader level where you kind of get away with both, right? I can say something false, I'm just joking. Then I can say something that's not funny, I'm a commentator. And I think that's the issue for me, is like, how do we judge those people, right? Because if your only purpose is to make me laugh, great, make me laugh. But if suddenly you're someone like Stephen Colbert, who's for some reason dancing with Chuck Schumer, and then the second he's not funny, it's like, oh yeah, but I'm making a broader point. It's like, no, your broader purpose is to make me laugh. That's it. Otherwise, shut up.
I mean, that's a topic that endlessly frustrates me. And, it's not even just the Jon Stewarts and John Olivers and the late night hosts now. Even podcasters who have no expertise in anything, they'll talk very, very seriously and very in depth about topics they have no idea about. And then when they get called out, they're, well, I'm just a podcaster.
Just asking questions.
Yeah. I think since October 7th, the stock of podcasters commenting on world events has gone way down for me. Like, to me, it was really illuminating how much some of these people I really relied on for my commentary really know nothing about anything, and they never have.
Yeah. It's very eye-opening when you listen to a lot of these people. There's one is, if you're entertaining, that's often seen as a proxy for knowledge or understanding. Kind of the same what I said about John Oliver. He's British, therefore people think he's smart. It's like, trust me, there are some really dumb British people out there. But just make a funny face, you get away with anything. But it's like, just because someone's entertaining or funny doesn't make them correct. And that's the big thing, is that we just see these, it's kind of the morphing of political space and the celebrity space, is we just assume someone's famous, assume someone has a platform, and we just assume good faith, which I think we should do. But if someone is showing you over and over again that they're acting in bad faith, and you keep allowing them to hide behind the good faith nonsense, I think that's when the consumer needs to be waking up and actually thinking, do I put trust in this person? Or do I at least still engage with their content, but through a lens that actually understands they may be talking out of their ass on this topic or many topics?
Yeah. So how do you draw the distinction between commentators and journalists? I mean, you spoke about this you were on the Rubin Report, reflecting on conversations that I had when I spoke to Candace about Israel, and it sort of revealed that there's a problem that goes on both sides of the aisle in the commentator class, where we now have, you have podcasters who are just talking about anything, but people who specifically in the political or cultural space having takes on things. There's such a wide array of authority that people have on particular issues, but you have to talk every day and give your take. So what, in your mind, is the difference between the commentator and the journalist, and what responsibilities relatively do they have to their audience?
Well, I think the journalist is a very rapidly shrinking category of people. Whereas now journalism means you have a Twitter account and you simply repost what's going viral on Twitter. That is not journalism. That is not a journalist. I think there are a handful of journalists still out there who are motivated by just uncovering the truth, right? They're not motivated by a narrative. They're not motivated by their own bias. It's just, this is happening, I'm going to go find out the truth. That's what journalism should be. And now it's become anyone with thumbs and a phone is a journalist. Like, people call me a journalist all the time, and I take them up and I am not a journalist. I sit there and I tell you what I think about something that's going on. I also try and do what too few people do, is admit when I don't know something, and I'll go away and look it up. This happens when I go to college campuses. Hopefully not too often, but if someone asks me a question and I simply don't know enough about the question, I will tell them I don't know. But that's something that you do not see in the commentary class, is that not knowing is a sign of weakness, and you have to have an opinion, and you have to have an opinion now. And that's the big problem, is you see people jumping on every single issue. Journalism has to be now. That's another problem. But if you're a commentator, you're pretending to be a journalist. You're taking someone else's so-called facts and you're just spewing it out as your own, and usually plugging the gaps of ignorance with paper while you're doing it. I think commentators and journalists couldn't be more different. It's like the difference between an author and someone reading a book, right? There is no overlap except for perhaps the language they're sharing. You are not the same. And I think any commentator calling themselves a journalist because they've hastily Wikipedia'd something the night before they talk about it is not the same thing. Like, I'm not a journalist. I will never claim to be a journalist. Kind of in the same way, right? Like, sometimes some of the content I put out there hopefully makes people laugh, right? I'm not a comedian. A comedian is I think one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult types of art form there is. Just because you're occasionally funny doesn't make you a comedian. And I'm not just kissing your ass right now.
Yeah, no.
I honestly believe it.
Yeah.
But it's when people say, oh, I'm a comedian, when they make slightly funny jokes every now and again to try and hide behind the fact that they're wrong, for example. I think these categories mean something. Journalist means something. I think we need to get back to respecting true journalism, but also holding then journalists to account for not being activists, for telling the truth, and for actually going after the stories that matter.
Is the problem, though, that less that the commentator is calling themselves a journalist, but rather the general population is consuming commentary as journalism? And in that sense, the responsibility is different. Like I'm editorializing, I'm giving my takes, and people consume that as fact or as journalism. But I wonder if the standards need to just be more laid out and clear, especially because under the guise of it's less that commentators are calling themselves journalists, but more that journalists who are calling themselves journalists are really just narrative-driven people in the space,